Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with me as we try something new. I mentioned in a fairly recent video that both indie and traditional publication have some quality issues. Fiction writing is a challenge and isn't something that comes natural to most people. Fortunately, we don't have to go it alone. There have been several successful authors, writers, and old-school academics who have written books on the how. The world is filled with people trying to get rich in the how-to genre, including many who've never successfully done what they're preaching on how to do. Today I'm covering a book written by someone who has done exactly what most of us are trying to do: become a successful novelist. Before we get into it, a few things. First, this is a video on what I've taken from the work we're reviewing. This is both a review and a commentary of the information within. That means the information I present might not be entirely true to the book, or even the author's intent. It is what I have pulled from the book itself. This video is not comprehensive, so I encourage you to pick up the book and give it a read if it sounds like it's something that might help you. Second, I'm running an art contest. Entry is simple and something most artists already do. Draw a pinup and enter for a chance to win one of 3 $200 commissions, and possibly get your art showcased in this section of my videos. The full details are in a linked video in the description. On to the author and the book. If you watch my normal book reviews, you'll notice I'm a little spotty on the author. That's because I'm there to critique the book. Here, things are different. If you want to be successful, you look to those who've done what you're trying to do, and you learn from them. This means we need to know a little bit about the author. John Gardner was a successful author, writer, and college professor from the last century. He's most well known for the book Grendel and has published 13 other novels. His teaching career covers about 23 years. He taught at Chico State College, San Francisco State College, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and Birmingham University. He died in 1982 as the result of a motorcycle crash. The book on becoming a novelist, which we're covering today, from what I can gather, was actually published after his death in 1983, along with another instructional book, The Art of Fiction. So let's get into some posthumous writing. I'm going to level with you guys. Gardner jumps around a bit in this book, and retreads the same path more than once. This is usually to expand on something he's spoken about earlier, and like most old school teachers, drives the point home through repetition. I will do my best to avoid repeating myself, but I can't promise anything. This book can be easily broken down into 3 parts: Preface, Part 1, and Part 2. I will also put a conclusion and discussion at the end. But we'll start with the preface. This book starts off with Gardner attacking what he calls scam writers. He immediately assures us that if we're reading his work, we're probably not scam writers, and that we probably have genuine interest in the art of writing. The scam writers being those who churn out low-quality books for easy mass consumption. There are a couple times in this book where he comes off as elitist, but it can also be construed as love for his craft. The two aren't mutually exclusive. One of the first points he makes is that we should strive for publication to be proud of. This is more to do with putting in the work and making something you would be happy to be credited with, not a low-effort story to be consumed in a month and forgotten in a season. Then we get into the fun. He takes time to let us know the problems all authors have, about the odds of getting published being terrible, that there's no end to artists who are starving, that alcoholism is the eternal hazard to the writer, and he reminds us that even good writers can, and often do, fail. Finally, he tells us this book is to inform us on what to guard against and what to expect on the journey to becoming a novelist. After that bright and cheery preface that should scare no one away, we come to Part 1, which he calls The Writer's Nature. He immediately asks the question that bothers many first-time writers: do I have what it takes? This question will rarely get an honest answer. Gardner informs us that the first publication will always be the hardest. The difficulty comes in getting that first win. Gardner is from an older time when the only way to get published was through one of the publishing houses and impressing the editors therein. Times have changed a bit. I want to remind you this book is 40 years old, but we'll continue on with this point. If you find yourself having trouble, there are things you can do. Win contests and prizes with your writing, start with smaller publications, and work on your notoriety basics. This is still good advice today. Awards and smaller publications are resume padding, and assurance that your work is good. Now, is it worth doing this stuff today? I'll leave that up to you. But one thing he's not wrong about is that good practices in writing will do nothing but help your publication in the future, even if you go indie. He also stipulates that bad practice and advice will keep you bad. Gardner spends some time informing us of the dangers of bad practices and advice, the trick being identifying these bad habits and working to unlearn them. Later in the book, he gives greater detail on avoiding bad teachers and groups, but we're not there yet. He moves on to verbal sensitivity. This boils down to understanding the meaning of words and how they sound and when to use them. English has many phrases that sound crazy when used in the wrong situation. His example is the term, "we are gathered here today," and how it would sound nearly insane at a business meeting. I imagine the same could be said of the term "get good," used in an intensive care unit. Gardner makes a pretty big deal about verbal sensitivity, but he assures us it's not everything. It can even hurt you. It is possible to become a great novelist in other ways, he assures us. I have to agree, as there are many stories I've enjoyed that have clunky wording, but they're interesting enough to pull you through. Every writer will have a different verbal sensitivity, just as every writer has a different background. This, I believe, is more true than ever. Our fractured culture keeps driving us into more isolated groups. You need to look no further than your average political tweet to see what I mean. Next, Gardner moves on to pace. He notes that your pace needs to match your scenes. It also needs to match your characters. Your pace is determined by what's going on in your story, who's acting, and why. It's important the pace reflect the intent genuinely and not be forced into the story. This, if I remember him correctly, can be done by and leads to the subject of using exact and vivid metaphors. Gardner has a lot to say on metaphors. Most of his gripes are with the unoriginal. How a trite metaphor or an overused one can make a story dull and bore the reader. It's also important for it not to be too original, but one you can understand. I've seen a few people using old metaphors they've seen in movies without understanding their meaning or origin, and I believe that brushes up on what he means. He spends a lot of time on metaphor, and I don't believe I can personally do justice to what he says. So if you want to know more on the subject, you'll have to read the book. He does say that such things can be helped by a love of words, an ear and an eye for language, if I'm quoting him correctly. His description makes it sound like a light touch sort of thing. Don't care too much, don't be too heavy, don't make it a poem, don't be too weird. He does say don't a lot. He's telling the truth when he says the over-the-top metaphors can hurt a story. I remember one by George R.R. Martin about a storm sounding like a fat man with diarrhea. Now you all get to share in that horrible memory with me. He comes to what I think is his most important point next. People expect a story. The best thing you can do is make them forget they're reading. Your story should feel like a continuous dream. You don't want your words to pull them away. You don't want to be ungrammatical. It's possible that caring too much will get in the way of this. His suggested fix is to care about the elements of fiction and the people who will read your stories. Know what your audience will go for, and don't try to hurt or challenge them in what you make. He says it's important to back away from your work. Anyone who sets down a manuscript for a month and comes back can tell you the benefit of that. Next, he moves on to what he calls punsters. This section left me a little insulted. Punsters, in Gardner's definition, are people who disassociate in their stories with a bit of detached levity. People who can make light of a situation. Gardner believes that while these people may and have seen great success, they will never be true novelists. I feel only slightly insulted, as I believe a bit of humor helps. Then I remember the tidal wave of cringy humor in modern Marvel movies, and it's hard not to see Gardner's point. So I'll mark his comment on punsters as noted. His next point I do have to agree with. The story must satisfy the reader. To do that, he lists out a few things. The story must move and progress is expected. The story is more important than word choice. Words should complement, not overrun the story. Don't fake feelings with dishonest wording, sentimentality, things that you don't feel or recognize, and don't use feelings as the description. Find your own descriptions, don't be too rigid, and as an author, don't wear a mask. So what are these masks Gardner's talking about? Well, they're more a style of writing, but he goes into better detail about them. His first example is Christian Pollyanna, the idea that everything is good, will always turn out right. He says this mask is the most common, and perhaps it was in his time. I'm sure you're all aware of this type of writing, even if you don't think you are. Think of some of the older Disney movies, 90s to pre-90s era. There were certainly dark things that happened, but there could often be unwarranted feelings of positivity. Something that made it feel not quite true to life. Before you go thinking Gardner was completely against positivity and Christianity, he turns around and attacks Dis-Pollyanna. This will feel more like what's prevalent today. The idea that nothing matters, that everything is interchangeable, and that the systems are inherently bad. Gardner's descriptions are cynicism, brutalist, contrarian, everything is false, attempts at shock, and Marxist or legalistic language. If you're in your 20s or younger, this was the bulk of your entertainment growing up. While Gardner does make a point here, much of this can be boiled down to the style of the time. If I remember correctly, Pollyanna, or some semblance of it, comes from the early half of the last century. I could be wrong, but as it's described to me, I pictured Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia. This Pollyanna can be most easily summed up by modern entertainment. Things like The Boys, the Marvel movies, and most of the current superhero Hollywood genre. I use these examples because after his mention of the two main masks, he tells us to rise above taste, learn all the different styles, consider your words and rhyme, and read broadly. As a writer, any set of beliefs, wording, or worldview can be a tool. As a craftsman of any kind, the most important thing you can do is know your tools. Gardner does make some suggestions for improving and becoming what he calls a true novelist. I'll simply list them out for you. Get a good freshman composition book. Do writing exercises. Improve your vocabulary. Read good works, paying attention to the words. Learn to make the vivid and continuous dream. Gardner was a teacher and gives advice that writing is something that you can catch on to, and can only be done if you're working at it. In writing, you need to know what you're saying, that the words mean something and ambiguity is your enemy. There is a limit to this advice that he acknowledges. Not everyone interprets things the same way. This is both less and more true today. His meaning, and what he talks about, is that different regions of the country can interpret words and phrases differently. Now, it's more accurate to say people of different political factions interpret things differently. This goes back to know your audience. Gardner moves on to what he calls the accuracy and originality of I. This, he says, is choosing what's important in a scene, not forcing your characters to do what they wouldn't, and knowing where the actions must go next. All novels contain characters. Each has their own needs, wants, and knowledge. Many writers will force a character to do things that circumstances, personality, or past would not permit them to do. You can see this with the butchering of once nefarious criminals in comics and movies, people who are supposed to be insane and evil, and yet the story must come to a screeching halt so the author can make a quip, that even I wouldn't be that evil, about a political position they don't like. This is also present in The Good Guys. I'm just going to call it what it is. Don't put propaganda in your novels. Gardner spends a bit more time on the author's eye, telling us to scrutinize our own work, to watch out for generalizations, and to use caution with adverbs. This will bring us to what is the author's eye? According to Gardner, it's how you use words to describe what's going on. One example he uses refers to the aftermath of a car crash he witnessed. He was shocked that the first thing he did was want to describe the things he's seeing in his head. The puckering of bruised skin, the mangled metal of the car, the smells, the sights. This concerned him because he felt he should be more concerned about the people involved in the crash than his own personal quirk. This can be applied to scrutinize. Are you portraying what is actually happening? Is this really what they would do next, and so on? Am I portraying what's actually happening? Gardner moves on to the power of metaphor. This is something he spends a lot of time on. My takeaways were: name what's significant, take from your own experience, and use your own words. He mentions the temptation to copy more famous authors, but there's a danger of coming off fake. By using your own words and experience, your words will be genuine and your meaning clearer, and they will feel more original. He also notes that imitation isn't bad, but it should be used solely for learning. We jump back to accuracy, but this time for the author. He tells us we need to understand ourselves to be true novelists. His suggestions are to document your feelings and ideas, to question how you would describe a scene, and to be genuine with yourself. I agree. It's hard to properly write if you don't know who you are. I don't mean in finding yourself. You need to understand your own strengths and weaknesses, your loves and hatreds, and your personal quirks. It can help you remove your bias, but add and control your linguistic flavor. It will also affect what you can write. Not everyone can write the same thing, and Gardner tells us the hardest perspective to write is omniscient, having the ability to hop convincingly from one character to the next, making them feel like complete people with their own beliefs, fears, and wants. It's important to love your characters. Many horrible stories have come from writing a character you hate and will lead to nothing but an unlikable character and probably an unlikable story. You can't approach a story topic if you have an irrational hatred of it, and it will at best come off as bad and probably come off as preachy and bad. Gardner encourages us to research in all places: books, magazines, and case studies. Magazines might be harder today, but there's still lots of places to do research. Many writers joke about their search histories, but if it doesn't look like you should be on a list, are you really doing justice to your work? That's just a little joke, and be careful out there, folks. The hardest and most controversial part of this book will be Gardner telling us to be social, or in his words, be fascinated by others, to celebrate them, to observe them, even in situations that would make most introverts uncomfortable. Being a devout people watcher will improve your vividness, he says. He also says that, in the end, all you have is yourself to go on. I get what he means here, as our characters can only be based on what we understand of ourselves and others, but it all comes from you and your interpretations. He moves on to the storyteller's intellect, and lists the things that he believes a perfect novelist should be. He says they should have wit, obstinacy, childishness, mischievousness, fixations, visual memory, earnestness, patience, psychological instability, and be addicted to stories. There were more things he listed, but it made me imagine Mr. Burns as the doctors showing him all his diseases and how they can't kill him because they're all just trying to fit through the same door. Gardner goes on to say most novelists don't possess all these things, that it's just his ideal. You can decide for yourself if you believe these things are needed or not, but none of them are bad things to have when telling a story. Good, bad, fiction. It's a weird statement that requires you to relax your brain to fit it inside. This is what Gardner uses to describe much of the churned out work of his day. The successful stories that were simply unoriginal but profitable. It put me in mind of the authors who churn out romance books at breakneck pace, swapping out the names, place, and cover art. Basically palette swapping an old story. He also comes back to This Pollyanna, the theme of nothing means anything, something I suspect he had a real distaste for. But this is more a comment on what he calls the age of bad criticism. This is a term that I'm sure rings bells for many of you. You have to look no further than Rotten Tomatoes and their critic scores disagreeing with the audience scores. It feels more true than ever that we're in an age where bad criticism is around every corner, and it even feels like bad criticism is affecting major studios. Look no farther than the Panderverse for a good example of that. Gardner tells us to be observers when it comes to others, but warns that it will make us unnerving. If you want to be a good novelist, you'll have to observe the world around you and ask the question we've asked before. How would I describe this? We're encouraged not to skip the gory details, to be professionally odd, and to detach ourselves from what's going on for the best observation. Every profession comes with its oddities. The carpenter or electrician will look at a house and think of what's behind the sheetrock. An engineer will look at a bridge and wonder about its structure and load distribution. As a writer, your subject is everything and everyone. So it's only natural for us to watch others and think, what words would best describe this scene? Why would they say that? What is the meaning behind this action? It may make you odd to others, but such is the nature of the profession. Gardner goes into what he believes a true novel should possess. The first being, the story should be an unbroken and continuous dream. The second, that all questions be answered. Third, that it doesn't test the reader. Fourth, that it doesn't use more than it needs. Fifth, contains an element of strangeness. I can't argue with the rules, but the last really sticks with me. Contains an element of strangeness. That special something in your story that feels off, different, unique from the everyday. This may mean something different today when we're literally spoiled for entertainment, but it should still be something we strive for. The staleness of the path over-traveled has killed many series, and not just books. Familiarity can help, and you want a certain amount of it. That comes with not testing your reader. But you want that hint of oddness. Something to make it feel different. To make the reader take notice that something new is going on. It's easy to fall into bad habits, so Gardner reminds us that the story is not the message. That theme is not all fiction. And to be wary of those who try to sound smart. Basically bad teachers. But he covers those in more detail later, so we will as well. He gives us a list to help keep us from bad habits. Remember that you're telling a story. Your characters must be interesting. That stories are stories first. Don't preach, don't push your characters to do what they wouldn't, and never be false. This last one I took to mean, don't let your characters be false. If your character would do something you disagree with, it's probably best to let them. This is the character's story. The readers will want a very good reason if they break character. Gardner takes writing very seriously and says the good novelist will put their writing first. They will neglect their other responsibilities, relationships, and engagements to write, research, and edit, perfecting their craft and weaving their stories to the detriment of the rest of their lives. I can't agree with this in total. To work hard and continuously is what it takes to be successful. I believe even the Bible says to work one job and then do another. Bet you never thought side gigs were biblical. But it's important to live and to honor your responsibilities. Caring for your family, friends, and self are terribly important. That being said, if you truly want to be a writer, you may have to shun things like video games, vacations, and many other luxuries that you take part in during your free time. Time is a finite resource, and there's no point in sharpening a blade if you're going to hang it on your wall. He tells us that your story needs a plot, not a series of surprises. The plot, he says, is a series of revelations. This can feel like a distinction without a difference, but let me make it clearer. It's like finding something out for yourself through your own merit and hard work, or having someone else call you out in an argument and embarrassing you. You want the discovery to be exciting, not jarring. Gardner clarifies that it's a mistake to hold back information from the reader. Then he clarifies that it depends on the point of view character. In other words, it depends on what your main character knows as to what the reader should know. He even says that the unreliable narrator is not a narrator at all, but a character in the story. He goes on to talk about suspense done right. that real suspense comes from moral dilemma, not circumstance. That it comes from what a character must do and their feelings on it, rather than the things that happen to them. Choices make suspense, not what is foisted upon a character. Those who cannot act are victims, and victims don't make stories. If they act, they aren't a victim. Last in part 1, he talks about what it really takes to be an author. More accurately, he says that no one can say what it takes. That most professionals are actually incompetent. That to truly write, you must perceive your world as if you are the camera. That you need a demonic compulsiveness, and to ask yourself if writing is what you truly want to do. And with that, I will see you all in part 2 of this Writer's Technical.